So let's talk a little bit about the Aquascape. I was designing a tank and a scape with SPS, or specifically aquapore dominance, in mind. And for that reason, I built a scape that is largely hollow with very little resistance to water flow. The other piece I had in mind was wanting the fish to kind of swim under the scape and have the corals on top. I'm showing here in the video just that I made it modular, and it breaks into 3 pieces so that in the event that I needed to do some work on specific corals, theoretically I could only remove part of the scape and not the entire thing. Also had to think of what direction people will be looking at the scape when I set it up. There's one view that is less favorable if you're looking kind of from the left. When people come into the what I call the aquarium room, they come in from looking from the right, and I feel like that's where it's most dynamic and attractive looking. So here we're looking at the scape fully submerged underwater, and I actually added that piece on the left kind of to give a movement of the scape as a whole, kind of starting high up on the right and moving kind of angularly to the left. And that's where I planned to add a little zoa garden. I added the fish after the nitrogen cycle had completed, which took about 2 to 4 weeks. I just started with Tim's nitrifying bacteria and fed ammonia to the tank and monitored ammonia levels. So about a month in, I added my first fish. It was actually a clownfish, presumably because they're more tolerant in general and very hardy fish. I actually waited till the tank has been cycling for 3 months before adding more sensitive fish, specifically the one spot foxface. My plan really was to mainly have herbivores that will do work for the aquarium. I added 3 tangs in simultaneously: a blue tang, a gold ring bristletooth tang, and a sailfin tang. I was really surprised to find that the dominant fish in the tank was actually the foxface, and initially there was some conflict between the tangs and the yellow foxface. They really kind of found their hierarchy pretty quickly, I'd say within the first or second week. I did attempt and quarantine my fish and set up a quarantine tank for that purpose. I lost more fish in quarantine than I did from any other reason, as you can see in the chart I added here. By far, the tang that earns its keep is the gold ring bristletooth tang, and it also is the one that has more or less stayed the same size throughout. Just to clarify, when I use the word cycle here, I'm referring to the entire duration which it takes a saltwater aquarium to reach a balanced ecosystem, and not specifically to the nitrogen cycle. As far as cycling goes, one of the things that I took interest in was the aquabiomics bacteria testing. Around 5 months into the cycle, I actually added some live reef rubble from Aquabiomics. 2 months later, 6 months into the cycle, I did the Aquabiomics test. On the chart above, you can see the diversity was at the 65th percentile, and the balance was at the 54th percentile. Per Aquabiomics, the diversity was higher than most tank samples they've received, and the balance was similar to a typical reef tank. The only pathogen that was found in it was cyanobacteria, a symbiotic group that's not associated with blooms in the aquarium, no coral disease, and 2 fish pathogens, Vibrio fortis and Photobacterium damselae, 2 of the most common in the hobby according to Aquabiomics. It's worth mentioning here that I allowed the tank to cycle for 6 months before turning on the lights. Above, I have created a brief timeline that depicts the steps I've taken and the process I have followed before adding fish and corals. I initially started with some fairly hardy corals, more likely to survive this early stage. On the top, I have two birds' nests, and on the little island on the right, I have a Duncan, a Favia, and worldwide coral alien eye candy cane coral, and a single zoa on the left. I waited about a month after adding my initial corals and making sure the corals were thriving before adding additional corals. Feeling somewhat confident that I have gotten this far in the process without any major hiccups, I decided to invest at this point in a little over 20 corals. Despite my best efforts and the time I took to plan and execute this tank, I ended up chasing phosphate despite having a tank that was responding well and corals that were growing with a phosphate of 0.1. Within a couple of weeks of adding a common phosphate remover into a reactor, my phosphate readings were undetectable. And within 2 weeks, I started noticing a brown film growing on my sand, which can be seen in the image above. Thanks to Max Reef Dino Support Group and an incredible pamphlet they put together, I was able to identify my dinoflagellates as amphidiniums, large cell, which unfortunately are one of the dinoflagellates that take the longest to eliminate and for which UV has no impact because they did not enter the water column and fortunately did not cover my corals and really remained mostly on the sandbed. And unlike Ostreopsis or Prorocentrum, are not toxic to the inhabitants of the tank. The theory behind treating the dinoflagellates is to add substances that would encourage the growth of algae that are less of a nuisance to the tank and would ultimately outcompete the dinoflagellates for nutrients and territory. Following Mac Reef's pamphlet, I initially utilized all the recommendations, including lowering my lights, vacuuming the sandbed, adding some additional Aquabiomics live sand, Phytofeast, Apex pods, and trigger pods. I also added silicates and hydrogen peroxide, which I will discuss shortly. Adding the Phytofeast proved to increase spirobid worms drastically. The Phytofeast is very concentrated, and having no evidence that dead phyto are feeding the desirable microfauna and potentially just polluting the tank, I decided to go with live phytoplankton, which proved to reduce the presence of the spirobid worms. I found myself to be most hesitant when deciding to add silicates, since most of the manufacturers were producing it for construction-like work and had big danger warnings on them. It really wasn't until I started adding the silicates that I started to notice a significant growth of diatom algae as well as pineapple sponges, both of which are beneficial and desirable. I determined its efficacy by taking multiple samples from the sandbed and glass and evaluating them under the microscope. In theory, knowing the dinoflagellates that I was up against would take months to resolve felt semi-accomplishable. In reality, after a month of waiting, I became discontent and wanted to speed the process up. Hydrogen peroxide was promising because of its potential immediate impact on algae and dinoflagellates. Hydrogen peroxide did not disappoint. Within days of dosing it, I noticed a significant decrease in all algae forms, including the dinoflagellates. Within weeks of dosing hydrogen peroxide, I started to notice a significant decrease in coralline algae growth. A month into dosing hydrogen peroxide, virtually all coral growth had ceased. After 2 months of dosing hydrogen peroxide, even though the tank indeed appeared mostly void of dinoflagellates, a significant decline in SPS health was noticeable, and I believe set back what little progress I had made in my battle with dinoflagellates. My overall conclusion regarding hydrogen peroxide is that while visually it appeared to reduce the presence of nuisance algae and dinoflagellates, the maturation in the tank that was necessary to naturally defeat dinoflagellates was halted as a result of the hydrogen peroxide and ultimately was not beneficial. Fearing that I had inadvertently affected the bacterial population in the tank with the hydrogen peroxide, I sent in an additional aquabiomics bacterial test, which shows a dramatic drop in the diversity from the 65th percentile to the 24th percentile. However, the balance went up from the 54th percentile to the 91st percentile. I cannot speak to the significance of these results or a direct correlation to the use of hydrogen peroxide. 5 months had elapsed from the first time I identified the dinoflagellates on my sandbed to the point where I could only see 3 to 4 dinoflagellates per slide at 10 times magnification, indicating that the reef tank had reached a balance with the rest of the microfauna in the aquarium and was no longer a hazard or a visual blemish on the tank.